Chapters 17 through 19 of Frankenstein really start to snowball the relationship between Victor and the creature. At the beginning of chapter 17, the monster has stopped his narration, and we get to see Victor's response. There's a sense that he doesn't know how to respond to this proposition that the creature asks of Victor, or I guess more correctly, demands of Victor. So um, the monster and Victor meet, and they begin going back and forth because the monster requests a female mate. Um, Now, this is probably inspired by the relationship between Felix and Safi. Um, Victor wants to help, but every time he looks at the creature, he's just reminded of this grotesque, monstrous man. He says, his strange words had an effect on me. I compassionated him and sometimes felt a wish to console him. But when I looked upon him, when I saw the filthy mass that moved and talked, my heart sickened. So it's interesting, actually. Um, some people argue that the creature is Victor's doppelganger. And a doppelganger is somebody who looks like somebody else, like if you have a stunt double in a movie or something, because the creature is basically Victor's alter ego, is what people like to argue. um, the creature kind of demands to Victor, I will be with you on your wedding night. Um, he takes this as a very serious threat because the monster will do anything in his power to get back at Victor for what he's done to him. Remember, this is Victor's first creation, his first experiment. But for the creature, he has to live this life. And unfortunately, that's not an ideal life, but that's a life he has to live. So, in the beginning of chapter 8, we see this fateful meeting between the monster and Victor on this glacier. And he decides, yes, you need to create this female creature for me. Um, Victor begins to have some doubts about the wisdom of agreeing to this, but he knows that this request will require him to travel to England. So, in the beginning of chapter 18, um, he decides to go back to Geneva where his parents are living. And in Geneva is where he talks to his father, Alphonse Frankenstein. Um, they're discussing if he should marry Elizabeth, and Alphonse says, you should marry her immediately. This should be something we do right away. But Victor doesn't want to marry Elizabeth right away. Now, remember that she is the adopted sister. So it's not that weird. Um, but he's considering that if he doesn't marry Elizabeth now, there may be struggles in the future. So he asks his father if he can travel to Europe or to England for 2 years, and he does this with Henry Clerval. Now I put a picture down here so you can kind of get an idea. Henry of Clerval. This is really building up the characterization of Clerval, and we figure out who he is. During their travel journey, um, he Henry kind of says, this is the life I want to live. But unfortunately, you are so depressed and gloomy. How can you live like this? How can you be so sorrowful? And Victor even refers to himself as my slavery, referring to the monster's request for him to make a second creation. Um, there is a tension here that we can't fail to notice as Victor has been torn in two directions. On the one hand, he feels a sense of obligation to grant his father this desire to marry Elizabeth, but at the same time, we also see him compelled to create this female mate for the monster, and a mixture of guilt and regret. So chapter 18 is also significant because that's where Shelley starts to build up Clerval. He seems very joyful. He sees the beauty of the earth, this very sublime idea. Remember, we're talking about romanticism and the idea that um, this sublime fascination with mountains and nature and trees and all of that really comes into play. Um, why will Victor not create the second creation? Why is he holding himself back? Well, he's worried that she might be worse. He's worried that he never will be able to have happiness. He's worried they might hate each other. She might also turn with disgust from him and marry someone who's actually very good looking. So he's very, very worried about what would happen with the second creature um, and how that would eventually play out. Um, by chapter 19, Victor and Henry have journeyed through England and Scotland, but Victor grows very impatient because he wants to begin his work and free himself from this bond to the monster. He still feels enslaved by this. Um, quickly, he leaves and kind of rejects Henry. So he sets up a laboratory in a small shack and he devotes all of the hours he has to putting life into a new creature for the monster. But he can't go through with it. It's so gross and unsatisfying to him that he is not a fan of creating this second creature. Um, the wretched saw me destroy the creature on whose future existence he depended on for happiness. So, as he is destroying this second creation, the monster watches him. And that's not good for Victor. We kind of ask ourselves, so who is the man? Who is the monster? Up to this point, we can conclude that the monster has very human-like qualities. Um, he can speak English, he can read, he's empathy, he creates relationships, he's very human. But who is more human? So finally, I just want to have you do some reflection questions. What role does Clerval play? Remember, we say he's the foil character to Victor, and how does that portray throughout the novel? And do you agree with Victor's ultimate decision to abandon his work and not make another creature?